And get started. Want to welcome everyone to the DMICE Thursday noon conference. And today is also what we call an IDL talk. IDL standing for the Informatics Discovery Lab, which is a new initiative in the department that many of you know about that is looking at trying to build bridges external to the university, especially to industry, but with other partners as well. And so today we have a speaker from EPIC, who many of you know of EPIC, and we've had an enjoyable week working with them, looking at ways that we can make our academic program function, work better with them, give students and actually faculty access and so forth. So our speaker today is Dr. Bret Shillingstad, who's a physician who works for EPIC. He's part of their clinical informatics team. By background, he's a board-certified general surgeon and previously was co-owner and co-manager of a multi-specialty group practice, and while in practice used several different electronic health record systems, voice recognition software, and then in 2004 transitioned to working for EPIC. And he's involved in many aspects of the EPIC system there, and I had the opportunity to get to meet him earlier this year, and we started talking, and it's evolved to this, and we really hope that this will be the beginning of mutually beneficial collaboration between the informatics program and EPIC. And not only on the clinical side, I see a bunch of bioinformatics folks here too. EPIC's plowing ahead in that area as well. Data analytics, all of the areas that are really driving informatics. Bret actually is a native of the Northwest, sort of. Grew up in Montana, attended Carroll College there, and then went to medical school at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. He did his residency in surgery at the Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and then also there did a fellowship in surgical endoscopy. So he's going to talk to us today about relationships between informatics and clinical end users.
To come here today. Is the mic working, or hopefully it is? Okay. And I wanted to cover a number of different areas and give you some ideas, and we'll certainly leave enough time at the end for questions and answers, and certainly anything you want to ask, I'm happy to try to answer. There's been a lot of factors affecting electronic health records, as we all know. With the Affordable Care Act and meaningful use, there's been tremendous amounts of money out there. We've seen a huge movement from paper to electronic. One of the things that's amazed me most traveling the world is how the United States really currently is about 2 to 3 generations ahead of Europe and the rest of the world, which is something that may be somewhat of a surprise. And actually, Singapore, Middle East, and most of Europe is adopting U.S. systems because we're actually currently the leader. And that's led to a lot of changing roles with vendors forging ahead. What are the partnerships with academics? How do we integrate stuff such as genomics and personalized medicine? And how does meaningful use, compliance, and professional organizations fit into this? I think there are some things that are definitely hampering and slowing development, items such as meaningful use, which help get medical records more used, is also slowing it down because it can take weeks to figure out how to implement meaningful use requirements. Certainly, who's going to control medical IT? Is it going to be more vendors, government, or academics? What are the areas we can work together? And certainly trying to figure out where those partnerships are is important. Okay. So I think some of the areas that I'd like to touch on where there's some natural areas for partnerships is providing and maintaining evidence-based content. Many of the medium to smaller customers throughout the country have no bandwidth to maintain their content. Hospitals of 50 to 250 beds have no way to keep order sets, templates, and everything up to date. How can academic centers host that content and make that available? Real-time clinical or cognitive decision support. Epic supports the capability of using web services to host that and actually allowing customers to subscribe to clinical decision support. Certainly interpreting and integrating basic science breakthroughs into the electronic health record, areas such as genomics. Certainly the area we'd all like to get to is instead of just having generic protocols, actually looking at patient attributes and coming up with areas where we can deploy personalized medicine. The other area is leading meaningful use and compliance rather than the government. When the government comes up with these criteria, very difficult to employ these because they never consider what data is captured during a workflow. They never consider how it's going to be reported. And many times what they choose is not necessarily things that are going to improve outcomes. For example, having pre-coordinated data elements like EKG in the past year are kind of meaningless. You know, it's better to capture EKG and then have a post-coordinated attribute of the date. And by having people who understand informatics help with this stuff is going to make it much more easy to comply with these. And then certainly developing the health record and clinic of the future. Your simulation center is very exciting. I'm going to show some of the ideas we have at Epic. And we'd love over time to get the ideas that you have as you start doing simulations as to how we can better interface end users, patients, and the hardware that they use. So evidence-based content, as we talked about, many of the early adopters were academic centers. They're the ones that actually create the evidence-based content. Most of the late adopters are smaller to medium-sized hospitals who don't have the bandwidth to do that. And there's really a clamor as to how they are going to, with a very small team and being non-academic, stay up to date with the content that they need. And some of the ways that we can do that is by pushing that content out to them, and it can be hosted externally. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of what that might look like here. This is actually a patient who has a stroke. And we have some stroke guidelines. And one of the ways that this currently works with UpToDate, HealthWise, and other content vendors is you can actually, with a single click using an alert or by right-clicking on a diagnosis, you can pull in the current guidelines. And this is where we're currently at, kind of an info button type approach. But one of the infrastructure areas that exists is the ability to put in XML objects within these documents. So you can see the blue fields here. And for areas where a customer did not have order sets or wasn't maintaining them, you can actually make these actionable. So you can see for a stroke, I should get a CBC, check a cholesterol level, maybe get a duplex Doppler ultrasound. And this is actually generating orders based on the XML tags within the document. This is something that would go a step beyond actually providing just content within a document. The next level would be actually sending attributes of the patient out to a central server that ran algorithms, and then based on that patient's personal characteristics, sent back a document that was even more specific with actionable items within the document. Many people have looked at doing this. This is current functionality, but really having academic centers such as yourselves taking some of these capabilities and going through the content, creating the tags, and hosting this on a server either locally or selling the content, which would be refreshed quarterly, would be a huge service for small to medium customers and even large customers that are not academic. One of the other areas would be real-time decision support, and we've seen some of that occurring with the Pediatric Head Trauma Consortium. There's a group of about 5 pediatric academic centers that are taking 5 or 6 patient attributes and sending that de-identified data to a central server that's being hosted between Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Denver Children's, and a number of other sites. And based on the patient's characteristics related to their head trauma, whether it's loss of consciousness, whether they've had a seizure, whether they have a headache or other symptoms, it will send back a personalized workup for that patient, whether that patient needs a CT scan of the head or not, whether that patient needs to be admitted and observed for 24 hours or any other additional workup. This is really the only one where we actually see real-time personalized decision support, but I think there are huge opportunities for people to develop those algorithms, host those, and then generate the documents and protocols that would go back to different sites. Another interesting example is I ran across an algorithm that they had created in Radboud University in the Netherlands. And they actually have an algorithm that will look at 40,000 different diagnoses. And I think it's looking at 5 to 7 patient attributes. They can narrow down 40,000 diagnoses down to about 3 or 4 using an algorithm. But finding those areas where you can take rules and host those externally and feed those back to EMRs, EPIC and non-EPIC, is a huge opportunity for improving care. The other thing that's exciting is you can imagine that if a drug's recalled and you're pushing out protocols with actionable XML objects within them, you could withdraw a drug from one of those protocols immediately and substitute something else. If there's a better treatment, you could immediately act on that, and if it's querying a central server, you could change and influence care almost immediately if we had this sort of capability set up. One of the other areas is interpreting and integrating basic science into EHRs. There's a lot of screening recommendations. We can look at National Institutes of Health and CDC recommendations for genomic markers. We've had some sites, such as the University of Virginia, take all of those and translate those into health maintenance alerts, where it will change screening protocols based on different markers. Certainly some of the other things that would be neat to see in there, since most EMRs have the capability of using that genomic data, is how does that affect narcotic dosing? How does that affect drug choices for specific patients? And really getting down to the level where we're personalizing care based on data within the health record. One of the areas that's been a challenge with this is HIPAA. And some of the areas we've come up with to get around that is patients sharing genomic data with other family members directly. So for example, in MyChart, the patient portal, a patient could decide that they want to share the fact that they have a breast cancer marker with maybe granddaughters, their daughter, maybe with cousins. And they're the ones making the choice to share their own personal health data with other people, which circumvents the whole HIPAA problem of the healthcare provider doing that. But certainly better ways that we can come up with sharing data directly as well as in a de-identified way to personalize medicine. One of the other exciting areas is just the incredible amount of hardware and devices that can be used to change care. And this is something that we've seen huge leaps in, whether it's iPads, smartphones, stuff that has computational power that you can take in your pocket that didn't exist until recently. Some of the areas that we're looking at that would be great for your simulation lab is how to really change workflows from the typical registration desk where patients move around throughout an organization. For example, coming up with concierge types of care where someone has an iPad, they see a picture, they take the patient directly back to a room, and most of the care is delivered in a room. Having on a touch screen and on monitors in the room the visit roadmap. First, the nurse is going to come in and do this. Then we're going to do a blood draw, kind of leading them through and giving them an idea of how that care is going to continue throughout what they're going to do at the organization. bringing services to the patient instead of having the patient move around the hospital or the clinic. Some of the areas we've looked at is actually using smartphones and iPads to actually direct staff which room to go to next and what blood draws to do, which room to go to next to do an EKG in the clinic, instead of sending the patient to the EKG lab, sending them directly to the lab, and really changing the way that healthcare is delivered within an organization. And then even on the inside corridors, having directives for the providers, where the patient's at in the process. So instead of kind of the colored flags above a door, if you had 2 entrances into the room, putting some interactive stuff to kind of direct the staff as to which room to head to next. Some of those dashboard views in the central work areas and touch screens to direct doctors and nurses which patient to do next, even in x-ray areas, clinic areas, and so forth. And then room layout. I heard that there's some architects and others in your informatics program or people with those types of backgrounds. A lot of attention is going into room design. Is it better to have swinging tables to move stuff closer to the patient? Are mechanical arms better than using an iPad, which doesn't have a keyboard and may have some limitations for data entry? And then even some alternative room configurations where you think out of the box and maybe put desks in the corner where maybe you can get 3 or 4 chairs around and patients and physicians and clinicians can huddle around, look at screens, and discuss a case. But I was thinking with your simulation lab, these are great opportunities to set up different room layouts, bring in patients, and have them sit and see what promotes the best interaction, what minimizes the back time that the patient has with the doctor where he's facing a keyboard and a terminal and providing care. And then really some interactive screens. What sort of content is valuable as far as sharing with the patient, where you almost make it like a whiteboard that is displaying patient-level data, along with patient-level data that's interactive. So this is a touch screen where you could actually grab the pulse, and the nurse could slide the pulse value down, change the blood pressure readings with the arrows, but at the same time, you could discuss with the patient whether they're meeting blood pressure goals, where their BMI is, and whether they need to lose some weight, but making the data entry interactive at the same time with the patient. And then leveraging some of these screens for patient education. Patients have long wait periods sometimes in rooms. Physicians run behind. I was guilty of that many times. But even putting up some patient education and videos where patients could make better use of their time, where they could learn something about a surgery or learn something about diabetes management, and using some of this downtime educationally with screens that could be mounted within the room.
Not have them read those old magazines from
Exactly.
That's a lot of current practice.
Yeah. Plus, the other benefit of pushing out patient education in the rooms is patients will find ridiculous stuff on the internet that has no medical basis, but you can kind of direct them towards medically accurate information that won't give them some crazy ideas about care. The other thing we've looked at is even educational games for kids, where they can play games to learn about nutrition and even do some educational gaming during wait times. And then one of the areas where we have a number of customers doing quite a bit is telemedicine. And I think with accountable care organizations in medical home, this is something that's going to really become a rage, because to minimize patients' loss of time at work and loss of time at school, much of the care can be provided using telemedicine. And we're doing some of this. We have some sites such as UC Davis and many of our Minnesota customers doing this. Blue Cross Blue Shield actually reimburses about $35 to $38 per telemedicine visit. They've actually shown that many physicians actually increase their volume and revenue by performing telemedicine, by getting that reimbursement, even though it's at a lower rate, because they can quickly log on, take care of the patient, and move on with their care, or even do these at the end of the day. And where we're going next with this in the next 7 to 8 months is actually supporting this on the smartphone as well. So currently this requires a webcam or a built-in camera on your laptop, but using that on phones is going to be a neat step forward. But you think of a lot of dietary education. You could have 8 or 9 different patients logged on, and you could be doing interactive diabetes teaching via telemedicine, save people drive time and lost time from work. Remote consults. You could do remote consults with patients who may be 2-3 hours away. Follow-up visits. Great ways to really leverage technology and minimizing lost time for the patient and provider. So this is some of the stuff that we currently support with the smartphone feature coming out soon. Some of the other areas that are interesting is data aggregation and clinical research on large cohorts. We've developed in Epic a data warehousing solution which we're looking at pooling among multiple customers. And we have a number of customers, such as one in the St. Louis area that has a lot of extra server space, and they're willing to host and pool multiple instances of Epic on a single server where they could actually churn through data that would be a combination of several Epic sites. And certainly where you don't have a large enough number of patients to do that, you could do in a much more effective way if you had, say, 10 or 15 million patients instead of the 2 to 3 million patients that you were working on. So this is something that we're working on, and we have sites interested in finding partner sites to do this with. I know Dartmouth is doing the same thing in the Northeast, but certainly if there are those of you in the room interested in that, I could get you groups to get in touch with to start pooling some data. Some of the other stuff that I think needs to be addressed where we could use some leadership is data standardization. So the more data that's standardized, of course, makes it easier to share. Legal agreements really seem to be the biggest impediment for sharing patient data and doing research. We've had a number of states actually change the state laws to allow research as well as data exchange. In fact, Wisconsin and Minnesota both changed their state-level laws to accommodate more data exchange. But this is something where informaticists can really play a leading role in dispelling the myths and realities of data exchange as well as research on large cohorts, where we can kind of educate the public about de-identifying data and even ensuring patient privacy if the data is not de-identified. And then I think translating and disseminating the findings, real-time and near real-time through peer-reviewed venues. Some of the other areas that I've found really interesting as I travel is we have a lot of customers using Epic in other languages. And when I go especially to the Nordic countries, one of the expectations is that they'll exchange data between, say, Finland and Sweden and Denmark, which it sounds easy because we do that in the United States, but to do that across languages presents a whole other linguistic challenge. Certainly there's some data elements, such as those tied to SNOMED, which is internationalized, where you have an item number for the diagnosis. And for Epic or any EMR to display that in another language is fairly simple. We just display the diagnosis in Swedish this time or English. But then there's other areas such as notes and other text documents. How do you get the key data disseminated in another language? We do a lot of stuff with the Coast Guard and some with the Department of Defense and State Department. But how do we exchange data, for example, with NATO countries and other stuff? And this is going to become more and more of an issue because no one really trusts Google Translate to run inside of an EMR and do Google translation of notes. Probably a lot of patient risk. But at the same time, are there natural language processing solutions that could be looked at to kind of reliably pull out data and present that in different languages? One of the things that has come out in our 2014 release is the ability to data mine a text note and actually pull out the medication, symptoms, and diagnoses as discrete data, and then click on those and add those to the problem list and medication list. It would be really neat to have someone look to see if that could be accomplished across languages. Could we data mine a document in English, pull out a medication list, and then convert the medication list and the diagnosis list into, say, Swedish or French or German? What would be the application? Right. So some of that, I think, relates to the fact that people are just so mobile, especially in Europe. A lot of these countries have 2 to 4 million people, but people will travel all throughout Europe. You go to Southern Europe, and there's a lot of areas where only 40 or 50% of people speak English, whereas 90% of people speak English in Northern Europe. If you got a patient who is critically ill and you wanted records from Sweden, how would you do that? Same with NATO. A lot of times the U.S. will pick up an injured patient who may be with the French or these multinational forces. How do you query their medical records that may be in German or they may be in Finnish or another language? But I think as the world becomes more and more mobile, this is going to become more and more of a challenge. Yeah. The thing that's really been striking to me is how different Southern Europe is from Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. I'll go to Southern Europe, and 40% of the time the cab driver may know English. But I'll go to Northern Europe, it's 90-95%. But same goes with Eastern Europe. There are definitely pockets where there's less English speaking.
When people talk, and they press the buttons.
Mm-hmm.
So one other implication here of the language barrier is as we're rolling things up for research purposes, and we're now starting to aggregate this data at higher and higher levels across the world, and we're starting to mine through those notes or mine through those other text areas to get implications for research. Speaking English, they may speak English, but speaking English and practicing medicine in English, or even asking a question in English, apparently, are two very different things. So.
Mm-hmm. So, yet another area that we could look at, I guess I could jump over here very quickly and just show you some of the features that are coming up when you get to 2014. But this is actually called chart search, where I can actually go into a patient's record here. This environment's so slow on my laptop, but it should be there. So one of the features that we've added is this chart search, where I can actually go in and put in, hypertension and actually have it read through the note and find information on hypertension. So in this case, I can see using natural language processing that there's actually 2 items on the problem list, 24 notes, 22 medications related to hypertension, labs, and so forth. So this is a tool where I can actually go through and just look at labs related to hypertension, just go through the various notes related to hypertension, and actually go through text documents and do this. The other iteration we have of this is something called Note Reader, which will take a text note and pull out discrete data that you can then add back into the database. One of the thoughts I've had that no one's really looked at is, since we can do this with an NLP engine, many times it works in 20 or 30 languages, would this be one of the potential linguistic solutions for presenting data in different languages?
Will it pick up things like hypertensive retinopathy that may not have the keyword hypertension in it? Or will it pick up a urine protein creatinine ratio that may not have been attached to hypertension?
So this is actually using logic that's being co-developed with M-Modal or with Nuance. And then there's a third NLP engine we're working with as well. So these are rules that are being co-developed between the two. What a lot of this is using is groupers. So we'll basically have a hypertension grouper of labs that everyone kind of agrees are related somehow to hypertension. And then it's using a lot of grouper technology for, well, groupers that get manually created for labs, medications, diagnoses, and so forth to try to pull this stuff up. So there's actually a lot of maintenance in the background that's being maintained with groupers.
Essentially doing like a Bayesian on the back end. You're doing a Bayesian of the.
Yeah, that I'm not as familiar with. I haven't done a lot of the development part of this, and this just came out this month. So I'm just starting to play with it, and I'm sure I'll be getting into some discussions with developers some more. But kind of neat about how we're able to leverage NLP, and you saw how fast it queried about 200 visits on that patient. It took about 10 or 15 seconds to go through with an NLP engine and do that.
So what are you guys doing on the front end here? So it's easy to put it hypertension, but if I'm sitting here in the clinic and all of a sudden now I've got 200 actionable tasks, the data density is actually increasing exponentially is one problem. And then, of course, the other thing is do you actually potentiate misinformation, right? You look for a term, you just go through a confirmation bias and realize that the term you're looking for is there, therefore it must be true and must exist. So I guess the question is what kind of testing on the front end to see how to actually use it? It's a very powerful tool. The question is how to best use it.
Yeah. And that's been one of the challenges. This is our first release of it that came out this month, and we actually have a disclaimer that pops up the first few times you use it, saying that don't, rely on this as your only tool, and certainly provide feedback. And we're allowing people to provide feedback, because what we would love to do is to continue to narrow down the groupers, narrow down the rules, and try to make it more and more intelligent. Because I think you're exactly right. You could get back thousands of results if you put in a very generic term. If you put in something very, very specific, you might miss other stuff. But how we're going to be able to create rules and algorithms is something where we need to partner with informaticists to try to make this as safe and reliable as possible. Some of the other areas that we're moving into that's really changing medicine, and I think the eye tracking research that Dr. Gold and others are doing here provides some exciting opportunities. When I first started at Epic, pretty low resolution, 13-inch monitors were common. Then you started seeing 20-inch high-resolution monitors. Now our latest releases of Epic support 24-inch 1920 by 1080 monitors with very dense data on each screen. And really, what is the best way to make these usable? Is it to have some vertical scrolling and be a little less data dense? Is it better to have one pane with some scrolling or three panes without scrolling? And what's the most efficient way for people to aggregate data? Because I don't have a projector that'll show this, I'll show you some screenshots. But you can see here we actually have three panes in this particular example. This is orthopedics, where they can create or attest to a note, do their billing, and then see all of the in-basket messages and results that have come back outside of this visit and attest to those and move to the next visit. And you can certainly create notes, do those attestations, and clear out everything into single steps. So I can just go through each pane and move on to the next patient, making it very quick because everything is existing in three panes. Now, the next level we're going to is actually allowing you to choose a body region. So every result, order, and so forth will be related to a body region. So if the orthopedist clicks on shoulder, it automatically filters down to all films related to the shoulder, all prior visits related to the right shoulder, along with all surgeries related to the right shoulder. And then you only see diagnoses related to the right shoulder, and then you can complete your visit. But by narrowing down data by one or two body locations that you're addressing may be another advantageous way to do it. One thing that's very unclear is this the best user interface? Is the actionable pane best on the right where they create the note on the right side? Is it better to have your actionable pane be the left or the middle one? which panes are best for data review. I think with eye tracking and other investigations, we can figure out how to really leverage a lot of the high-resolution tools that are out there, because we can present it in a lot of ways, and you can configure it almost any way.
So, I have a question. I mean, the idea of being able to filter out specific things seems like, at least in theory, a good idea for being able to narrow and deal with some of the data overload. But how far does that go? I mean, can you narrow, you know, because there's a bit of a large collection of tools, and do we use the search tool to bring up things, or do we use this? I mean, can I narrow, say, if I picked medication, could I narrow by, you know, the indication for that medication and all the side effects of that medication, all the dose changes and all the related drugs and anything that has an interaction? I mean, you know, how smart is it?
Yeah. And, you know, with chart search, we can do that, and I think there's going to end up being different clinical uses. So maybe in the clinic, body location makes the most sense. So a gastroenterologist wants to look at the colon, and he sees all the pathology results for the colon, all the barium enemas, all of the colonoscopies, and then he's really just addressing the colon. In the hospital, it may be problem-based that makes more sense, where you're looking at sepsis or systemic issues. I don't know what the answer is going to be. Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I think it's testable.
Right. And really what I'm showing you are tools that could be used, but I think how they get used, these are things that informaticists are going to have to figure out, which is going to maybe even, you know, involve some randomized trials where you set up one clinic one way, another clinic the other. You look at outcomes, maybe look at some eye tracking, what seems to be most efficient with the least eye movement to get where you want to go.
Do you see that extending into the physician's training?
I think so, because all of these screens now can be personalized, where you can actually delete and add things to the header. You can change your activities at an individual level if you allow people to have the security to do so. You can even rearrange the order of the navigators and how you go through a visit, which I think improves efficiency. I think some of the concerns have been is, are there certain guardrails that have to be in place? Like maybe physicians can't delete code status, because that's just something that they should see, you know, front and center. But I think physicians are going to start personalizing more and more as we get savvier end users who start leveraging some of the personalization.
What happens when you now do the diagnosis of sepsis and the patient has something else going on, has pancreatitis, for example?
Mm-hmm.
Now you've gone along the wrong path because you chose the wrong thing right from the beginning, and you're completely lost.
Yeah. And I think that's where you have to have some overview screens and try to get people to look at the data. I think there's two extremes with the data. There's data overload, because obsessive-compulsive people sink when they start using an EMR. Because with a paper chart, you had, you know, your problem list on one page and maybe some sticky notes in the front of a chart, and you were comfortable looking at 2 or 3 different parts of the record. Some people get into an electronic health record, and they feel they have to look at every tab. They have to view every lab, every x-ray. They're so afraid of missing something and being medically legally liable that they look at too much data. But how do we, in a smart way, present data so stuff doesn't get missed, but at the same time maintain efficiency, which is I think, a balance between the two. Because I'll tell you, you can put a lot of stuff on a 3-pane, high-resolution 24-inch monitor, which may be good and it may be bad, as far as that goes. Yes?
I know one challenge that we've really had here with our physicians since the Epic Go Live, not just our physicians, all of our clinical users, has been them hunting through the chart and looking and looking and looking for data that's never there in the first place. Mm-hmm. And, you know, trying to teach around that and to say, well, yeah, there are 12 different places you can look for orders, but orders are really all in one area. So if you look in one of those 12 places and it's not there, it's really not there. And not spending an hour trying to comb through the chart looking for that CBC when it actually never made it to the lab and you never have a result anyway. And that's been a real challenge we've worked through kind of in that data overload. Or we haven't worked through yet, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and a lot of that we've really tried to push out to customers and get sites to do this, which most don't have the bandwidth to do this for every specialty. But here's an example of a cardiology patient where the cardiologist doesn't really care about PSA values or the prostate ultrasound, but they really care about these snapshots. And on these screens, having the capability of seeing the studies of notes. So if I want to see the cath, I can see that. If I want to open up the last cine run, I can pull that up directly. If I want to look at the last EKG, I can pull up the EKG directly. But getting all the key data on a single screen. Now, that's a lot of effort on the project team to do that for maybe 100 specialties where you have all sorts of specialties and subspecialties at an academic medical center. Now, on the other end, what we've done, which has been somewhat controversial but has been very effective, is offering these free physician builder classes at Epic, where physicians from all over the country fly in and learn to create and manage these reports themselves. That scares the project teams tremendously to think that doctors are going to go in and build on the tech side and do some of this. But with sufficient security and guardrails, you can kind of give them the ability to do some customization with hopefully not getting into too much trouble if they're just modifying their own department. But this has been a move of trying to push configuration to end users and away from project teams.
So a lot of what we're doing around is also different between omission and omission. So how do you know if something is not present in a record? And sometimes we have both an accuracy and a precision issue where sometimes those things are omitted because it's data dense. It's on a screen where it is there and you just can't see the forest through the trees. And then you go to another view where you can see that individual tree because it's a much smaller forest. So you do end up going to a lot of these different pages. So either smart filters or smart designs. But I think what it gets down to in the end is a lot of times we come up and identify these issues after the fact, right? A perfect example was when we went live with Epic a few years ago. We realized all of our hemodialysis patients weren't getting any of their antibiotics that were scheduled with dialysis because it ended up on the PRN list. Because it's scheduled after dialysis, which is not at a scheduled time, and so patients weren't getting any of it because the nurse would go to the only goes to the PRN list for things they think they need to administer, right? So again, developing structured ways where you have controlled environments to test these so you can learn about the unintended consequences, I think is going to be the key going forward, instead of learning about it after the fact when you have a sentinel event. I think that would be the thing. So I would say as a company and for what we need to do as informatics groups is our goal should not be coming up with solutions based on sentinel events. Our goal should be trying to anticipate sentinel events and preventing them in the first place through better testing up front.
Right. And I totally agree. And I think there hasn't been a lot of that done. And it's a huge opportunity to do a lot of that. The NLP thing, this is our first iteration of putting NLP directly in an EMR. And we still don't know what the bugs, the good and the bad are. But I think we're going to learn a lot as people start to use it. I'm sure they're going to find a lot of data they didn't find before. But are they going to find all of it? And will it be, or too much of it? Yeah, which is going to be something to look at. And then really the other thing that's been a struggle is figuring out those use cases for tablets and iPads. We've seen a lot of sites put tremendous amounts of money into buying tablets, iPads, and other devices only to find out that physicians don't use them. Ultimately, many times it comes down to the fact that it's easier to enter data on a keyboard. A mouse is much easier than using a tablet or an iPad. But what is the best GUI for doing that? Is it large buttons where you're tapping buttons? Is it more of a voice recognition with generating discrete data elements out of a blob of text? What's going to be the best use case going forward? We're developing more and more of this, and we're seeing some areas where they don't do a lot of data entry, such as pre- and post-op anesthesia, which ends up being pretty amenable. But then there's other areas such as neurology where there's a lot of complexity of documentation of cranial nerves and other stuff where it's just not practical to do that documentation. But figuring out where the use case is for some of these portable devices, where it works, where it doesn't. Currently on your smartphone, you can prescribe ambulatory medications. And there's a huge push from physicians to allow prescribing of inpatient meds, which, well, maybe some inpatient meds you could do that. But is it safe or even wise or advisable to, say, order drips and TPN on a phone? Maybe that's kind of a ridiculous use case.
Like you're moving from bed to bed, and if you have a tablet, instead of carrying this portable computer, you can just do it.
Exactly. So, but then you almost need a different user interface because you've got limited screen real estate versus a large screen at a full workstation.
Is that then up to Epic to design that, or is that something that Epic wants to open up to?
I think we'd love to open it up and find out, groups that are able to do it fairly effectively. So we're always looking at groups to partner or try this stuff with because we don't always know the right answer. Some of the other areas that we've developed is personalized touchscreens or wall screens. So when a respiratory therapist walks up to a screen in the ICU, it shows just respiratory therapy stuff, ABGs, vent settings, so forth. When a physician walks up, he gets a different summary view versus a nurse who might see the MAR and a work list of things that she needs to take care of. We'd love to co-develop that and get input. And I think with your simulation lab where you could set up different walls and rooms with different hardware on it, you could really come up with some neat use cases as to how to do this. Right? Exactly. So I wanted to leave plenty of time for discussion and not use it all in just me talking and throwing out some of my needs and ideas of things I'd like to see developed. But you're always welcome to email me. Pretty easy email address, Bret with 1 T. But at this point, I'd love to open it up for questions and allow 10, 15 minutes or so of questions for other discussion.
Let me just ask people to push the microphone button in front of you so it gets recorded on the recording.
Yes.
I have two questions. One is sort of regarding sort of the volume of information. When you stick information in an EHR, it doesn't have sort of a physical instantiation. So I thought, have you ever thought about developing sort of a metaphor for the amount of information that exists to give clinicians a sense of how much information they've dug through and how much they still have to dig through? And a second question is, have you thought about implementing a system to enable shared situational awareness? Because if you have multiple clinicians looking at the same medical record, it would be interesting to see like who's read what pieces of that medical record.
I think that's a great idea. That's something we haven't thought of, but it would be neat if 2 or 3 different specialists are looking at a patient and you could see who's looked at the vent settings today or who's looked at other data and say, gosh, no one has taken a look at their vasoactive drips and so much look at their drips because no one's it'd be great to kind of track that. So no, I think that's a great idea. We've talked about a dashboard view, and we really need some clinical sites to help us with that, but it'd be neat to have a physician dashboard that showed what they needed to do, which patients needed to be seen next, and then on those patients, what are the lagging problems that haven't been addressed or no one's taken a look at that day. But it's a lot of logic behind it.
Plus, there is also requires some kind of an acknowledgement because from the physician that they did acknowledge that somebody would have to acknowledge it because you look at the ICU accordion. When you look at the ICU accordion, you have all these drips and things going on. So somebody who's just clicked on that could mean that they have acknowledged everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the areas we struggle with is some sites use the audit trail to say just because a physician went to the screen, they looked at the lab result. But if they clicked on that by accident and then immediately left it, how long do they have to be on that screen for it to be looked at? Which I think it would be not completely perfect, but you'd have to get people to agree on what is having viewed the data.
Or I mean,
know from the audit trail is, from the work that we're doing is that just because you're on the screen doesn't mean you looked at anything useful on the screen.
Exactly.
The example that we showed yesterday where the one piece of data that was the most important piece of data on the screen was the one thing that was not looked at even though everything else was.
Right.
And I think the other issue is going to be, and I think this is going to be the real challenge, is alert or notification fatigue. I mean, I think the perfect example is, even though 10 years ago, the IHI said, when the 100,000 Lives campaign, there would be no more wrong side surgery, right? No more taking off the wrong leg or the wrong arm or the wrong ear, whatever it may be. And 10 years later, that has not changed in the United States, even though everyone does a timeout before a procedure where they say, okay, we're going to do a timeout. We're going to go through this and say, this is Mr. Jones. We're taking off the left leg, right? Everyone agree? You know what? We still make the same mistakes as a country, and the reason being is that after a while, if you put everything into a checklist or a to-do list or a task list, the end unto itself becomes completing that task list regardless of whether the task is actually completed. Right? It says, okay, I got to go through all my lists on my patients on my dashboard. I got to go and acknowledge the drip rate. Good, acknowledge. Got to do this. Good, acknowledge. Got to do this. Good, acknowledge. And then you actually do less cognitive input as to it because the task is to complete the checklist. And so I think that's going to be the real challenge with all this is to try to balance, to make sure you give people enough tasks to do, but don't overload them where they get the same task to do on everybody, they get task fatigue. Right. Maybe sometimes it's about varying the alerts. So maybe some days you make them green, some days you make them orange so that they don't, there's a lot of ways to do it. But the way we currently design it probably is going to fail if we increase the number because it's already failing.
Now, the most controversial thing that we've turned on in the latest release of Epic is a feature where when you get a medication alert, you can click a button that says, never show me this again. And you'll never see that alert ever again because the problem is in oncology and a lot of these areas, everything's poisonous and everything has an interaction, and they know it, and they're clinically aware. So do they need to see all these alerts with considering bleomycin and all that stuff? But at the same time, if you turn off that alert and it's critical in another case, it could affect patient safety. So we're very interested to see how many customers turn it on and what the feedback is from that feature because doctors are clamoring for it to get rid of some of these worthless alerts, but is it the safest way to go?
Maybe do it as a patient basis instead of provider basis.
Exactly. That might be another way.
So if it's bleomycin and you keep ordering the chemotherapy for 8 rounds for the same patient, once you order it once, then you say, okay, for this patient, never alert me about this. INH and rifampin is a perfect example as a TB doc. Right, every time you prescribe, the only time you ever give INH and rifampin together is to treat TB. I know that they both are hepatotoxic, and I know there's an interaction. There's only one reason to ever give the 2 medications on the planet.
Right.
So, but for that individual patient.
But then if you were to take care of a whole lot of those people, it will keep on coming to you each time you do that.
Right.
Epic now tells me each time I prescribe sildenafil that 40 milligrams 3 times per day is 3 times the dose of whatever. And it tells it 100% of the time, no matter if I ignore it, I don't ever want to listen to that.
And I think this is going to generate a lot of controversy here as you go to the next version of Epic. Are you even going to enable that? And be interested to see what decision.
So, there are a couple of points here that I think deserve a lot of further study. One is this idea of opt-in versus opt-out alerts, and maybe not one size fits all. You've got opposite problems with those kind of alerts, whether it's at the patient level, the provider level, or the hospital level, or anything. And the second is really kind of the smartness of the alerts, right? If we can state, I never want to see the alert in this case. I always want to see it in that case, we should be able to make the system do that, right? It's not clear to me that it's always so easy to get the system to do it, both from a technical point of view and a sort of a managerial point of view, organizational managerial point of view. But, if the patient's being treated for tuberculosis, don't show me this alert, right? But so I think a certain amount of both the smartness of the logic and how easy it is to implement that smart logic is really an important thing. A lot of these alerts seem the reason people hate them and the reason they get so many is they're just very, hitting, everything with a very big hammer and not really taking into account the fine points of the patient's situation or the physician situation.
This is where in terms of the system, in terms of a diligent decision maker, shared decision making, where again, for example, maybe we'll only alert you if the creatinine, if it's a renal issue, the creatinines are of a certain level and certain diagnoses are not on the problem list.
Right.
So you have the problem list there and no other laboratory abnormalities that would pertain risk, it will cancel the alert for you. Type of thing. So again, it incorporates other pieces of data, and that may be a better way to improve that data density in some of these search tools, where automatically you put in medication, Epic on the back end would say, okay, you're doing INH and rifampin, it automatically searches on the back end tuberculosis anywhere in either a node, a progress node, a problem list. Yes. Look at the LFTs. Are they normal? Yes. I will not give an alert.
And I think this is the one area where Europe is ahead of us, although they don't have as many features and functionality. Because there's minimal medical legal risk, the number of alerts that fire are just minuscule because no one's afraid of getting sued. So like the drug database vendors are afraid of lawsuits, so they have too many alerts. The notes are just incredibly short because reimbursement isn't based on the length of your note. So it'll say hypertension, this is a blood pressure, this is what I did, 3 lines are done. And part of this may just be medical legal that's driving these database vendors to put in too many alerts.
Yeah, although I know at some places, they, as an institution, usually led by a CMIO, they go through and kind of prune out these alerts, and so there's probably other ways to, it seems it's somewhat extreme to go all the way to shutting them off forever. But on the other hand, there's clearly too much now. How do you find that right area of noise?
It seems like you as a vendor are accruing a really nice data set that could be mined as well, the configuration decisions that all your customers are making. Because like you're mentioning, the CMIO and a committee makes all these decisions, what levels shall we turn on and off of the alerts. But if you can start saying, wow, in all these conditions, or the rule sets that people have made through their configuration of your tool, that would be a great thing to maybe start thinking about creating different levels of alerting that might be sold as like a package that people could subscribe to.
Right. And there actually is a tool where you can actually track how many times an alert fired, when in the workflow, and how many times per. There's actually an audit tool for best practice alerts. I can send you some info on that if you send me an email. Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, some customers use that before they turn on alerts. Now, this wouldn't help with the medication alerts that come from a third party, but you can actually turn on an alert in the background where the end user doesn't see it and then get a report how many times it fired, when they would have seen it, and so forth before you turn it on clinically. So you can tweak it and narrow it down so it doesn't fire too much.
I mean, I think this gets to the same issue, though. I mean, if institutions are making a decision on what alerts to turn on and what alerts to turn off, you would think that they could make the issue of, what alerts to customize or what alerts to have additional, conditions on in order to fire or be active or not be active, right? I mean, sort of, it would seem that would be a less severe decision than just saying, oh, all these drug alerts, they fire too often, we're going to turn them all off, right?
But this is one area where I think, again, the clinical decision support being maintained like an OHSU or by academic centers is huge, because if it was querying your server for Walla Walla and a bunch of these small towns out in eastern Oregon, they could actually be getting these updates, and as you tweak alerts and all that, you could be getting de-identified data and sending better and better alerts regionally.
We're going to talk about some of these APIs for exchanging data with these things, because it would just seem that there's a lot of smart logic that could be developed to take into these accounts, as long as you can get the data back and forth,
Yeah. And Epic has had some APIs available, but with the challenge from the Department of Defense and international customers to have more of them, they announced in September they're releasing a huge number of APIs that could be leveraged with Epic. So that'll be an exciting area to see how informaticists start leveraging some of these with the Open Epic. Yes?
Oh, and I was going to ask about that. Can you talk a little bit about Open Epic and how that whole patient-centered data
Yeah, so is the Open Epic site up yet, Matt, or? Okay. Yeah. So that's someplace definitely that would be good to go as far as that goes. And I know that they're going to be expanding that quite a bit over the next month or two. So, another area.
I just wanted to say on the content of the alerts, one other complicating factor of that is something you alluded to earlier, and that's all this outside content that we're bringing in and all this evidence-based content. So a good example of that is we get our medication database from First Data Bank. That comes with a whole set of medication alert and medication alert recommendations and all of that we bring in. So now if we're looking at going and customizing that every month or every quarter, when I implement an update from First Data Bank, I now have to maintain the customization of the alert, which is fine and that may be good, but it's an organizational decision to do that and then resource that appropriately so it can be done. And then, I'm always kind of looking at the organizational, the bigger kind of regulatory perspective and the medical legal perspective. So now if I've made the decision to turn those evidence-based alerts off at my institution and I get sued over a result, I now have the potential of having a legal exposure because there was an evidence-based alert that I did not provide to the provider. Not saying it's a possibility, or not saying it's a probability, but there's a possibility of greater exposure.
Right. And I think there needs to be more feedback with those. So some like IMO, which provides kind of extensions to SNOMED with synonyms for ICD-9 and all that, they've been very good because any customer can send feedback that they need more synonyms or to change them, and sometimes they'll get huge numbers of requests a month. I don't think there's really been that interaction with First Data Bank to have groups of hospitals say, you just need to turn these off, because none of us want to manually turn these off quarterly when we get updates. But maybe more direction from end users would be valuable. That might be another way to do it, is to see if you turn on, don't show me this alert again, is sending them the data back from sites that 99% of physicians always say, I never want to see this alert again, you should just turn it off. Or if it's 100%, just don't show it anymore.
Although maybe it should be like opting out of email, that they eventually find some way to get it back to you.
Yeah.
You opt out. And then, I don't know, a month or a year later, you're back on their list. So some excuse to sort of put it back in and then have you opt out again.
Right.
And
Opt out every quarter.
well, and I think the real thing is what is going to be your threshold for an opt-out? Because I think you always have to worry about the inmates running the asylum.
Right.
And so you get to the point where people will say, what is it, 80% of docs will say that they've never made a mistake, but they will say that 80% of their colleagues have. Mm-hmm. Right? And so, and that 80-20 rule works for just about anything with physicians. Conflict of interest, mistakes, plagiarism, malpractice, you name it. 20% will admit it, but 80% think their colleagues do it. Mm-hmm. And so when people want to opt out of something, you have to also then have the ability to then go and say, is this truly safe and affecting safety? Mm-hmm. Because just because someone wants something in some way doesn't mean it's better. I've been the perfect example of the way that people want the quote-unquote progress note to look. Mm-hmm. Or a lot of our screens get designed in a completely irrational way, saying, I want these 8 things on there as well, without realizing that actually may be causing more harm than good. Mm-hmm. So just careful of letting the inmates running the asylum.
Right.